Okay, now I'm excited to take you into the core of the course. We provided an overview with a brief scenario, with a smartphone for a hotel key to give us some bearings. But now we're going to dive into the architecture development method itself. We're going to look at objectives and other key elements to better understand and use the ADM successfully. We're going to start with an overview of it first, and then we'll look at the preliminary phase and phase A, which we briefly introduced before. We're going to hit the objectives of these two phases and then subsequently go into the other phases with their objectives and with the steps for all the phases. So the ADM cycle, its phases, and the objective of each phase is what we're going to cover, as I've said, with typical sets of steps for each phases that TOGAF, the specification, recommends, how we would keep track of the content that we're creating with each phase, and also just reiterate how the TOGAF ADM links to other parts of TOGAF, and leading into what will be our next lesson, which will be the guidelines and techniques for doing the architecture, adapting and doing the architecture development method. So first of all, the architecture development method is, as we said, core to TOGAF, is core to doing an enterprise architecture using TOGAF. It's out of the box generic though. So the architecture development method that we're going to be talking about is generic, but I tie everything to the brief case study because it helps you see how you could start applying it, not just to what we might say is a smart hotel, but to a smart enterprise. It's always about what are the new or enhanced business capabilities that we are helping to architect. So we would always need to adapt the ADM for our particular context. And for the use of the ADM to be effective, it must be governed. So we'll just reinforce that. We won't be going into governance in any detail in this course, but it's a given that for a method to be effective, there has to be a governance body, there has to be chartering, there has to be governance of the processes, of the data, etc., and of the oversight process itself. So we will touch on governance a little bit, but it won't be our main emphasis. So we'll look at what kinds of content would be created as we're doing this method, and also where we would store that content for reuse. A very important part of doing the ADM is scoping the cycle. The cycle is what we talk about the architecture cycle. We're really talking about phases A through F, and we'll be looking at that in a moment. You'll see that the picture of the ADM, but the cycle is really phases A through F. We had a preliminary phase, though, is what gives us our EA capability in order to cycle through A through F. And then we have requirements management in the middle, and we have phases G and H that help us with governance and change. But the scoping of phase A is the most critical aspect of the cycle, because we're going to have some cycle of change, like the one I provided earlier, smartphone for a hotel key. Well, that's a very focused scope, but still it's not simple to scope, and we have to see the scoping in light of all the other possible phase A's that could be linked to that same scenario. We'll also look at dimensions for scoping in terms of, for example, how much of the enterprise are we going to look at, how deep are we going to go, how granular are we going to get with any particular cycle. And the one example I just gave you, smartphone for hotel key, that's a pretty focused area, but it would require you to go quite deep. So it's still a major challenge. It's not a trivial change in capability, even though it's not saying we're doing the smart hotel, we're just doing one small part of a smart hotel, but we're going to talk about how we can better understand how do we limit scope. And the importance of TOGAF and its ADM is that, in fact, it is an integration framework that allows us to talk about change across different domains: business, information systems with the data and application architectures in there, and also technology architecture. So we can look across things and create different views of the building blocks, the current ones and the target ones, and we can still connect those for complete and accurate representation addressed to the scope of work that we agree on. So as we look at the ADM cycle, it's important to keep in mind that it is repeatable, cyclical model. In effect, it is an architecture pattern, a very valuable pattern on how to define a problem space and then seek solutions in a repeatable fashion, and then sequence those solutions again in a rational way, a repeatable way. It can be done for a whole enterprise architecture. So the ADM cycle is used to establish an architecture framework, develop architecture content, and transition to a transition architecture, and then also to govern the implementation of the architectures. So we needed the box, we need the content, and then we pull it all together, and then we need to govern it. All of these activities are carried out with an iterative cycle of continuous architecture definition and realization that allows organizations to transform their enterprises in a controlled manner in response to business goals and opportunities. So the iteration can be very sophisticated, and it needs to be ever more sophisticated given the relative complexity of the challenge, and whether it's a totally new capability or you're just enhancing an older business capability. But iteration is a very important part of this, but having a structured method with clearly demarcated domains and the idea of visioning, defining, selecting, and sequencing and governing and changing, that's basically the key thing that TOGAF helps bring with its very elegant approach of the ADM. So we'll look first at the preliminary phase, and then we'll look at architecture vision in terms of objectives. Why do we have a preliminary phase? Why do we have a phase A, which is architecture vision? That will be these will be the two most important phases for understanding the ADM and for mastering the ADM. So let's focus on those first. So let's take a preliminary phase. Use the example that we're an EA team that wants to be able to do a smart enterprise. And our first challenge is to do a smart hotel. But we want to have the capability to do smart enterprises, but initially our EA capability is around a smart hotel. But again, we're going to be the global EA force, and we're going to be able to do smart anything, right? So what does it take in terms of governance, skills, structure, the team players, and maturity, and so on, tools, all of that? That's the sort of thing that has to be sorted out if we're going to be able to then tackle multiple phase A's related to what would be our specialty, which is smarter enterprises. So the preliminary phase, though, is not something that is necessarily easy to set up, because what if you're the architecture, you're the chief architect, and you now say, I want to start using an architecture framework. I want to use TOGAF, I want to use the ADM, because I really want our enterprise of enterprises to help all enterprises be smarter, like let's say for a consulting engagements of the future. So you need to get support in order to establish that capability. So the first objective of a preliminary phase, determine the architecture capability desired by the organization. So I might be one person, I'm already a chief architect, but that doesn't mean that I can build that kind of global EA capability that I just described for being able to help all enterprises become smarter in terms of like next generation capability. So often we say in EA, you need it to be top-down driven, because if this is what's implied here with the two objectives I'm going to cover. First, determine the architecture capability desired by the organization. Well, if it doesn't desire to help with smarter enterprises, that's going to be tough to get it going. So but first of all, we need to determine the architecture capability desired, and then we establish it accordingly. Okay. So the caution there is that enterprise architecture, even using a nice framework like TOGAF, if somebody's not asking for enterprise architecture and not asking for a framework, there's going to have to be some socialization that's going to have to occur before this could get off the ground. But these are two very important steps, and I don't really want to modify them very much, because people say, Steve, how would you set up an EA capability? I would do this. First, determine the architecture capability desired by the organization and establish it accordingly. Now we move into phase A, and let's say we want to do, again, a focused effort, like we want to use smartphones for hotel keys. So let's with that scope in mind, let's look at the objectives. That's already in our mind, because we're setting up an EA practice at least that's going to allow us to do that much work, at least, maybe to prove that we have some capability in the domain of helping develop smarter enterprises. So phase A's vision overall, generically, is to develop a high-level aspirational vision of the capabilities and business value to be delivered as a result of the proposed enterprise architecture. And this is speaking of the proposed enterprise architecture scope in this case, right? So whatever your scope is, what is your vision of that? What value would it bring? And again, smartphone for hotel key as an example, I would have to articulate not just that I could do it, but it has business value. So it should be smart, specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound, so that we know when the idea expires of all the work we would do to articulate we should move forward with this. And then we could say, again, what's the value? Well, we'll get 20% growth in the millennials by being able to offer this type of hotel in the near future. We could get 20% within a year payback on our investment. So this type of thing is very important. It's not just that you have the vision of some technical capability, but what is the business value? And how smartly can you articulate that in an architecture vision statement, which is the name of phase A, architecture vision. So the visioning part is not easy to do. We use business scenarios as one way to help us articulate that, essentially brainstorming workshops. But that's something we'll talk about in lesson 3. So for the second and last step, or objective rather, of phase A, obtain approval for a statement of architecture work that defines how are you going to go about achieving that vision. So first of all, we wanted to say what is our vision and the value that would result if we're successful. And then we need to get someone to sign off on that in a deliverable, a statement of architecture work. That would include what are we going to deliver as architects, and when might this capability actually come about. So we're not defining the implementation projects, we're defining the architecture project and the associated work, which could include, as you might expect, a collection of models that we would do to show where we're at versus where we want to go, and also eventually a roadmap that would show how we're going to move from our current capability to our target capability. So these are the two most important phases for the TOGAF ADM. One is to set up the appropriate capability, and the next is to be able to scope effectively with a compelling architecture vision that would then get the support of the business.